We are seeing increased and escalated attacks on Eritrea. All kinds of accusations that come into play, whether it's the focus on President Isaias Afwerki or the internal politics of Eritrea. And something that I don't think we talk a lot about is the role of Eritrea in helping Ethiopia fight against the TPLF, which, as you heard there in the intro and you know very well, had 80% of the country's armament. So truly the odds were in the favor of the TPLF. So when you look at that, how would you talk about the role of Eritrea now and leading up to the transition of Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed's government?
Okay, thank you. Well, first, the current onslaught on Eritrea, against Eritrea, it is a deliberate, highly orchestrated campaign to manufacture consent in the West, among the international community, that the actual fight is being commanded and carried out by Eritrean defense forces instead of the Ethiopian defense forces. This is malicious and carefully designed propaganda, highly orchestrated propaganda, as you can see in all the media and social media, to portray and reinforce the long-standing perception among the West that Eritrea is the enemy and is interfering in Ethiopia's internal affair, that Eritrean defense forces are committing atrocities, and the fake Tigray genocide, which has been the mainstay of TPLF leaders and the TPLF digital, claiming and coming up with all sorts of preposterous allegations that Eritreans are committing atrocities in Tigray. Now, the second part of your question, with regard to the role of Eritrea in defending Ethiopia, I believe that Eritrea's role, when this brutal war was launched by TPLF, we have to understand the context. Very, very vital, which most people miss, Ethiopians and foreigners alike. When the TPLF launched, on that day of infamy, the brutal slaughter of hundreds of ENDF in many of the bases of Northern Command in Tigray, we must understand and come to terms that the ENDF was not at par with the TPLF militarily. Why? Because for 27 years, by design, by careful, deliberate architecture of the defense forces, the Ethiopian military was dominated. I repeat that, dominated. In fact, 95% of the Ethiopian officer corps that controlled especially the core functions of the military, the command, control, communications, was heavily TPLF Tigrayans. Now, you can imagine when that big chunk of the military, in conspiracy with the TPLF leadership, evacuates from ENDF in Northern Command and elsewhere in Ethiopia, the magnitude of vacuum, the huge gap that it would leave. That's what happened on the November 4. The TPLF has been working and planning, mobilizing over 170,000, close to 100,000 militia and special forces. And that was also reinforced by tens of thousands of TPLF Tigrayans in the military and the command of the ENDF. Basically, TPLF members within NDF who were a big component of ENDF in conspiracy with the TPLF. They were part of this brutal slaughter of ENDF Northern Command. So when that happened, the Ethiopian military, the remaining Ethiopian military, was in disarray, and there was a gaping, a big hole, a big vacuum, because as I said earlier, the most important, the vital functions of military, like command of brigades, regiments, and divisions, and the very critical functions like the mechanized units of ENDF were, for the most part, Tigrayans. So almost all, with very few exceptions, were part of the conspiracy planned by the TPLF to paralyze the military. That was the plan. That was carried out carefully and meticulously. And it was orchestrated, in that slaughter of hundreds of ENDF troops throughout Tigray was carried out with the complicity and direct participation of not only the militia and special forces of Tigray, but from top commanders, generals to colonels, majors, TPLF member Tigrayans participated in this. And when that happened, ENDF was in disarray, it was dislocated, it was paralyzed, it was in total shock and paralysis.
So
it is that context, within that context that people have to understand that there was no parity between Northern Command in Tigray and the TPLF led both TPLF Tigrayans in India who were part to the massacre, to launching the attack on 4th of November. And also 80% of the Ethiopian heavy weaponry, including missiles and rockets, were stationed in Tigray. And they cover the smoke screen for TPLF, which, as you know, before the prime minister came to power, the reformist government, it called all the shots, it controlled the military, it controlled the security, it was an overlord power in Ethiopia. So they deliberately planned and moved all the strategic weaponry of Ethiopia, 80% of us on Tigray. So TPLF calculated, number one, if we capture all the weaponry of the NDF in Tigray, number two, if we make sure, convinced that the TPLF Tigrayans within the military are with us, number three, if we make sure that all the TPLF and other Tigrayans within ENDF elsewhere in Ethiopia to be part of the conspiracy, we can definitely knock out the so-called military that we control. And as you know, they have very, very high contempt for all of the non-Tigrayan military. You hear them saying they are Iran boys, they are POWs. All the propaganda by TPLF leadership is displays, proves, illustrates the level of contempt that TPLF leadership have for ENDF, because for 27 years, they were calling the shots. They were in total control of not only the military, but the security apparatus, the justice apparatus, the diplomacy, and the economy. By the way, Hermela, G7, where I was an executive committee member and head of its foreign affairs, and also ISAT, we had several studies and reports, because we investigated, and there were findings that the command and control and most of the key functions of the military and security, federal police, were, for the most part, TPLF members. So it should not come as a surprise It was not like a military versus a military. So it is in this context that without Eritrea's active participation, because Eritrea has a very strong, disciplined, well-organized military, without Eritrea's support, not only when those brutalized ENDF soldiers fled to across the border, some trekking without clothes and shoes because they were cannibalized, brutalized, and were stripped of their clothing, even their clothing, even their, as God knows, it's so horrific. By the way, a must read is a sergeant who was there, Chacho. He wrote a book, horror story, harrowing stories based on several hundred interviews of Indian soldiers and officers. That is a must read on what happened, how it happened, even the role of Eritrea. That is the issue of question. So Eritrea fed, it clothed, it provided logistics for thousands of ENDF troops who fled after the surprise attack in the middle of the night, while most were unsuspecting and while asleep. So they fled. Some who managed to escape, those who managed to retreat, those who managed to be alerted at the last minute, they escaped. Eritrea played a vital role in sheltering, providing clothing, weaponry, and all forms of support, moral support, logistic support, so that our forces, Indian forces, who trekked, who fled that assault, that brutal assault, that horror, were organized and came back. They played a vital role in liberating Tigray during the first phase, along with Eritrean forces who paid dearly, lives and limb, and in blood, and ultimate sacrifices by providing support and by playing a key role in Tigray during the first phase of the law enforcement, which the Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed launched a week after that horror, which was perpetrated throughout Tigray against NDF by the TPLF.
And Neamin, you really laid out the all the resources that the TPLF had, including the 80% of the armament, the security apparatus, the economic stronghold, so much influence, I'm sure, that they were able to garner and plant over the 27 years. And if I was a robot and simply looking at the numbers, I would bet on the TPLF. But what do you think they did not take into consideration, whether it's in terms of resources? I remember listening to a parliament speech by Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed where he was talked about how he was rebuilding and renovating the Ethiopian Air Force during his first couple of years because it just wasn't up to par, and there were things that were happening behind the scenes that were strengthening the country's defense because, as he had said to the public, he was not in control of his military. I know at some point he even said he couldn't even leave his house without somebody having to approve it, someone that appeared to be allied with the former government. So Ethiopia had in place a military that was not loyal to the country, as is usually the case, but was loyal to the previous ruling party. And so there were many reasons, if one wasn't really considering the nuances of humanity, to think that TPLF would have, quote unquote, won this war. What do you think they did not consider?
Yeah, very important question. The TPLF, I think, failed to consider, as delusional as they are, that the Ethiopian people, first and foremost, have utter despise and hatred and rejection of 27 years of TPLF's impunity, tyranny, and domination in every sphere of life. They do not consider that anything that they do to come back to power, as they tried, would meet stiff resistance by the people of Ethiopia. That's exactly what happened. Number two, the moral and the courage which their brutality exacted among the ENDF. They were told, they witnessed the terror, the horror, and the sheer brutality with which the TPLF massacred their brethren, their brothers and sisters, ENDF soldiers. Though that really generated the spirit which fearlessly they fought when they came back from Eritrea, and those ENDF forces which were mobilized by the government to go into Tigray and carry out the counter offensive after what happened to Northern Command. So they miscalculated the level of courage, the level of the heroic spirit, their own brutality could unleash among the ANDF, which were told, and some were witnesses, those who were in Eritrea, who went to Eritrea, fled Eritrea and came back. That was also vital. The third aspect is what you say. I think, although the prime minister, I have a thesis that the prime minister did not really expect the TPLF would go this far in attacking the Northern Command. I don't think the government, as such, prepared, at least until the last few weeks or month after probably the so-called election in Tigray, that the TPLF would go to this extent, unleash such a brutal war, take such a huge risk. Even then, I think there was some preparation, even though last minute, to get some capabilities that tip the balance, including the drones. So those are last minute, even we can say desperate attempts to patch up the capability of India, because India ground forces, even the Air Force, even the Air Force was dominated by the TPLF loyalists. Most of the training, most of the capabilities, by design deliberately, it was made up of TPLF members. And when they left, even within the Air Force, there was a big gap. But the good news is that within a very short time, and this attests to the resilience of Ethiopians, the creativity of the Ethiopians, and also the resilience of the leadership and the prime minister, including, to creatively design and put an architecture and an operational plan to ensure that we have the capabilities to resist, not only resist, but defeat the TPLF in the second offensives. And now, of course, due to a heavy infusion from the former military, from top generals and to the military colonels, majors, technicians, trainers from the former airborne, former army, highly experienced during the third regime, those also played in revamping, strengthening, and building the capacity of the military. The other aspect is that there was massive recruitment and training, the fourth, I would say, the fourth element in making sure that ANDF has now finally the capacity to conduct, well-managed, well-led operations in Tigray. I think these four factors are very important: technology, the heroic spirit and resistance, the rejection of the military were brutalized by the TPLF and saw the horror and terror committed against their brothers and sisters, the massacre of Indian Northern Command, the will of the Ethiopian people, the rejection of the Ethiopian people, the spirit of the Ethiopian people, the total abhorrence towards the TPLF, held by overwhelming majority of Ethiopians. Not about the past, 27 years of impunity, massacre, genocide, horror and terror, domination, monopoly over economy, society, civil society, journalists being, muzzled and tortured and imprisoned. All that plethora of injustice by the TPLF, Ethiopian people were willing, at the request of the prime minister, to forgive the TPLF. But the horror they committed on November 4th generated and, in fact, brought out to the surface all that suppressed rejection and hatred toward the TPLF by the majority of Ethiopians. And Ethiopians fought in Gondar, as you have seen, in Wallo, in Northern Shoa, in Afar, with such heroism that the TPLF forces were finally on the run, on disarray, and defeated. And now the Operation Tigray is going very well, as you know.